Good morning to everybody. Um, First, let me thank the Center for Global Development for hosting the event, and particularly Liliana for doing the organizing, but mostly all of you for coming here, particularly in such a cold day. Um, so, I'm going to look at the other side of the coin of what Augusto was looking at. I'm going to look at growth from the point of view of productivity. Since time is really short, I'm going to go a little bit quickly. This is a very sad graph. This is a graph of half a century. And what it tells, the blue line, is that in half a century, Latin America has not closed the income gap vis-a-vis the United States. That's the blue line. So relative to the United States, the per capita income of Latin America today is exactly the same as 50 years ago, zero convergence. The green line says that Latin America has accumulated more physical capital and has accumulated more human capital relative to the United States. So it's kind of a puzzle. Why is it that if you have accumulated more physical capital and human capital, you have converged zero? And the answer is the red line. The red line says productivity in Latin America relative to productivity in the United States has been dismal. It's actually lower today than it was half a century ago. Contrast that with Korea. What Korea did, not only did it close the income gap, it closed it by a big shot. That's the blue line. They also accumulated quite a bit of physical and human capital, but what's really important is that productivity for Korea, they closed the gap vis-a-vis the United States, whereas Latin America actually widened the gap vis-a-vis the United States. So the lag vis-a-vis the United States of Latin America is completely due to productivity. We've actually saved more than the Americans, invested more than the Americans, and in relative terms, educated our people more than the Americans. Korea's spectacular development is partly due to the fact that their TFP did really well, but also that they, and this is Augusto's point, they saved a lot more and they invested a lot more. So if you take away short-run macro management issues, the other side of the coin that I want to emphasize in this talk is that by and large, if you look at a very long-term period, the growth problem of the region has been a productivity problem. And as Augusto was mentioning at the end, now that growth is back because the rest of the world is not pulling us, the productivity agenda, in my view, is going to be central to the growth agenda of Latin America. So I want to tell you 3 stories about productivity. How do we understand productivity? Why that red line? I mean, it's a complete puzzle, number one, and it's extremely sad. So why? So the first story is a story that says, look, Latin America misallocates human capital and physical capital. The markets in Latin America work really badly. The aggregate factor productivity of a country is just the aggregate of the productivity of all the firms weighted by how much capital and how much labor each firm puts together, right? So what it says is in Latin America, there are big obstacles for resources to flow to their more productive uses. And I'm going to use the word distortions with quotes because these obstacles need not only be distortions in the traditional sense, it might also be market failures, whatever you want. But they're impediments for resources to flow to the more productive uses. So it tells that what's behind that A function, the total factor productivity, is very complex, and we don't really understand fully what's going on behind that A function. But it says it's affecting the intensive margin and the extensive margin. What do I mean by this? People who should not be entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs, and they're running firms. People who should be entrepreneurs are working, but they don't have access to capital, so they can't run firms. So the wrong people are doing the wrong things. And in addition, firms have the wrong sizes. Many very small firms, and then large firms are perhaps larger than they should be. So both the extensive margin and the intensive margin are fixed. Physical and human capital could themselves be a function of all these distortions. That's the point that Augusto was making. And it says that removing all these distortions or these market failures could have a very, very large payoff because resources would flow to the more productive uses. So here's a little bit of evidence. This is the United States. And this compares what is the difference in the same sector. We're not comparing apples and pears here. In the same sector, what is the difference in the productivity of 1 peso of capital and labor in a firm, in a sector between the firm in the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile? In the United States, there's a little bit of a difference. But if you look at the rest of Latin American countries, what it basically tells you is, for reasons that we don't fully understand, take automobiles, take textiles, take food processing, take any sector, the same firms coexist, but the differences between the high productivity firms and the low productivity firms are very large. So this is a really pretty picture that it took us about 2 years to put together. It's you know, if you get excited about this, you're about as nerdy as I am, but I get very excited about this. What this tells you is this. This is the US, dotted, comparing only apples with apples at the 4-digit level. And it says in the United States, the more productive firm is about 4 times more productive than the average firm, and the least productive firm is about 1/16th least productive than the average firm. That's the United States. So it's not a perfect neoclassical world. There's dispersion. They should all be compressed in the middle, but there's some differences. This is Mexico. In Mexico, the more productive firm is 16 times more productive than the average firm, and the least productive firms is about 1/1000th least productive than the most productive firm. So if you ask yourself why, if you look at the sizes of firms, what you find is there's a huge number of very unproductive firms that are very small, has to do with the issues of informality and the issues that labor markets don't function well and the credit markets don't function well. So what this says is you're losing a huge amount of productivity because you're misallocating and your markets are working very badly. Second story is the human capital story. Is productivity is really bad in Latin America because we educate our children badly and our schools don't work very well and the PISA scores, we all know the story. I sort of believe that story, but it's a puzzle and a research question, a really interesting question. Why, if really human capital is so scarce, are the returns to skill falling at the top of the distribution? So that's so it puts some questions as to whether that's really the story that you tell. And then the story number 3 is a little bit the story that in some way Augusto was saying, which is, look, people think that productivity is itself a function of how much you're investing. And this is the view that even most policymakers have, which is you really have to invest a lot because investment will come with this new machinery, these new technologies, and that's what's going to raise productivity. And that's what policymakers have in mind. This is Cambridge flavor from the 1960s and 70s, Caldor, sort of large economies of scale in manufacturing, and there's emphasis on infrastructure and stuff like that. It's more of a macro story. Some evidence that that's not the case in Latin America. So this is, what is the change in productivity as a function of investment? And yes, in the advanced economies, that's kind of sort of a positive looking line. In the Asian economies, that's sort of a positive looking line. But very puzzling, in Latin America, that's a negative looking line. So it says it's not only a matter of accumulating physical capital, because you're accumulating a lot of physical capital, but something else is going on, because despite the fact that you're accumulating more physical capital, productivity is actually falling. So you're investing in the wrong firms or in the wrong sectors. So it's not a story about accumulating more physical capital and just investing more and saving more. It really, in my view, supports the story that there's a lot of misallocation going on here. So I'm short for time. What do I think, looking as a growth agenda, as Augusto was saying, what does the region really needs to do? I think the first thing it needs to do is it has to understand why there's so many obstacles for resources to flow to their more productive uses. There's a huge amount of misallocation, a lot of waste going on in the region relative to other regions of the world. And secondly, it needs to invest much more in human capital. The first task will read a lot of results, will yield positive results. And it might actually be very important because I have the hypothesis that in fact the returns to education in Latin America and the returns to skill in Latin America are actually being depressed by all the misallocation because you don't have the firms out there that are demanding all the human capital that are actually forming. So what does task do one? What does it really mean and why it's so difficult to do it? Because it would really take a systematic revision of all the regulations and the policies and the programs and ask yourself the question, does policy X contribute to resources flowing to their more productive use? Does our labor programs do that? Do our social programs do that? Do our social insurance programs do that? Do our taxations do that? And it's a very big task. There are many X's. And there's a lot of research done at the World Bank, at the IDB, by many academics out there that says for many of these questions, the answer is no. Our taxation system is not allowing resources to flow in more productive use. Our labor systems is not doing it. Our social insurance system is not doing it. In fact, there's a lot of recent research that says it's actually doing the opposite. It's actually pushing it into the more inefficient uses. So this is very difficult to do because behind all these institutions and all these programs and policies, there are deeply rooted social arrangements on taxation, on social insurance, on labor market policies, strong ideological beliefs, and a lot of disagreement. So we don't really have a consensus about that. There's a lot of evidence accumulated over the last 10 years that if you take almost anything, severance pay, non-contributory social programs, taxation, this taxation of small firms, and you go one by one, and the answer is almost systematically, this is not contributing to resources flowing to their more productive use. This is contributing to widening the differences in productivities across firms and across sectors, and is producing all these losses of productivity. What would the second task do? The second task would say, look, you have to think of human capital beyond schooling. We worry a lot about this, and there's a huge amount of research going on in this part. But actually, for the next 10 years, for the next 15 years, what goes on here is basically irrelevant. For the next 15 years, growth is really what happens here. Because it's the stock of workers that you already have in the labor force and the extent to which they can improve their skills or not. Education will matter, yes, I'm not putting it down, I'm all for good education, but education is not going to make any difference in terms of the growth pattern of Latin America for the next 10 years, and ECD will not do it either. I'm not against it, all for it. But for the next 10, 15 years, this is where the action is. And this is where you have to worry about. And that goes back to the misallocation story. Are firms training their workers? Are workers getting on-the-job training? Are they acquiring skills? Are they adapting new technologies? So let me begin to close because I'm running out of time. Raising productivity in the region is going to be very, very difficult. No silver bullet, no magic wand. Somebody wants the magic reform, the telecom reform, voila. The energy reform, tomorrow will be Switzerland, voila. No such thing. It's going to be a long haul of accumulating very many reforms to be able to do it. Can't do it without good macro, but if macro is bad, it's very difficult to do it. You have to rethink a lot, and in my view, the region has to go through something very painful, which is to rethink a whole bunch of redistribution instruments that it's been using, particularly those that bear on the labor market, that are part of the many disallocations that are going on here. There's very much country to country, and it needs a lot of pragmatism. And this is a scarce commodity in a very, very ideological region in which people look at the world through very ideological lenses. What do I need to mean by expelling Penelope from Macondo? 30 seconds. In Ulysses, the Odyssey, Penelope is a wife who's waiting for Ulysses to come back from Troy, and she has all these people that want to marry her, and what she does is says, well, look, when I finish knitting this blanket, I'll marry you. And during the day she knits, but during the night she unknits. So with one hand in Latin America, we do reforms to do productivity, and then with the other hand we turn around and we do a whole bunch of policies to undo what we're doing to do productivity. We have a complete chaos in terms of policy making, in terms of social insurance, in terms of labor market, taxation, it's complete chaos. So we need a systematic approach. And at the end of the day, what I really think is productivity is a reflection of the institutions, policies, and programs that countries have. I think what makes the difference between Asia and Latin America is that their institutions and their social agreements and their social understandings have been much more conducive to productivity. They've been much more pragmatic. They've separated the distribution issues in a better way. We haven't been able to do that. And Latin America will have to go through a difficult period of reflection if it really wants to grow again, and if it doesn't want to do it by sweat, but some by inspiration and by productivity changes. So let me stop there. Thank you.